Hello, my name is Kristen Edwards. I am the Chief Wellness Officer and Medical Director of Palliative Care at Yale New Haven Health Bridgeport Hospital. Today, I'm going to speak to you about proactive well-being check-ins for staff with direct patient contact during the COVID-19 surge. I have no disclosures regarding the following content. I'd like to thank my team. We had a fairly large and active team to make sure that we could do this across 5 different hospitals. Our objectives today, by the end of today, I hope that you will be able to describe an approach to conducting proactive and opt-out stress assessment check-ins, review keys to successful implementation, including the messaging to increase use of the check-in opportunity, and describe one way to creatively use resources already in place to provide these well-being assessments. This is a map of Yale New Haven Health with its 5 affiliated hospitals noted in yellow. As you can see, we run along the 95 corridor between Boston and New York, which is a major commuting pattern by train. This is a picture of Bridgeport Hospital, where I work. It's a 501-bed community teaching hospital. On March 12th, 2020, Bridgeport Hospital had its first case of a patient who tested positive for COVID-19. And like people everywhere, it turned our world upside down. Just outside of New York City, both Greenwich and Bridgeport hospitals experienced a significant surge related to the 95 corridor commuting patterns. When COVID hit, Yale New Haven Health mounted enormous efforts to take care of our patients and our staff. We set up a call center for both staff and community to have their questions answered. We set up 2 tents, one in the emergency department for triage and one that was actually a field hospital tent for the overwhelming patient volume we had. At Bridgeport Hospital, we staffed up to 5 ICU teams from our usual 1. We thanked our EMS partners for partnering with us to care for patients. And we delivered so much pizza. Our staff learned new processes for donning PPE. They developed protocols to take care of the scary new disease. They staffed up and worked overtime. From March to May 2020, Yale New Haven Health System took care of nearly 4,000 COVID-19 positive patients. Throughout all of this hard work, our staff also experienced tremendous staff stress and uncertainty. And many of them felt isolated and worried for their own physical safety and the health and safety of those who they love. Many of these stressors were not unique to clinical staff, and we recognize that non-clinical staff who perform tasks such as room cleaning, security, and facility management also experienced high levels of stress. And we knew we needed to offer something more than pizza to take care of the mental health of our staff. In recognition of the tremendous stress that these staff experienced, we launched well-being check-ins. The goal was to create a space that was encouraging and supportive without fear of negative consequences. Our initial launch was done at Greenwich Hospital, the Yale affiliated hospital closest to New York City, and because of its location, it bore the worst of our initial wave. For context, Greenwich is a 206-bed community hospital with a 10-bed ICU. At the height of COVID in our first wave, they had 112 COVID-positive patients, including 22 vented patients. So more than half of our hospital beds and twice our ICU capacity at Greenwich. These well-being check-ins were designed to help staff cope with the acute stress and prevent PTSD. They were designed to destigmatize the need for mental health care around what was really a community-wide trauma. All screening appointments were done by licensed mental health professionals. We were able to use social workers throughout our system to come and volunteer across the system to do these check-ins during their work shifts or on volunteer time. They were strictly confidential. We use the acute stress screening tool, which has 19 questions involved in terms of the symptoms that someone might be experiencing. And we use that to drive the conversation around what areas might somebody be experiencing that were acute stress. So while it was done as a stress screening tool, it was really the conversation that was the intervention. At Greenwich, we rolled it out as an opt-in program, meaning that people could sign up for an appointment if they wish to do so. We marketed it as a service to our employees and medical staff. And the notice of this service availability was sent by our human resources. After all of this effort, and it ran from the month of June, after the peak, which was in about mid-April. So after all of this effort, knowing the extreme stress that these individuals were under, we were a little disappointed that we had 2 people sign up for an appointment. We knew the need was much greater than 2, and so we reviewed our processes and implemented a much better process for the second implementation. Our second version was a Bridgeport hospital. This one ran from July 6th through July 31st. Again, for context, Bridgeport is a 501 bed community hospital. We peaked in mid-April at 226 COVID positive patients. So again, about half our population, half our bed capacity. We had 5 ICU teams and more than 50 ICU patients. There were some key differences in the way that we rolled out this version. So the first was that we set it up as an opt-out. This meant that appointments were scheduled for individuals. They were voluntary and they could cancel them, but they were just scheduled and told that this is the time that you have to attend them. They were scheduled by their managers or physician leaders. Internal marketing and communications were done by the chief wellness and chief nursing officers. So we used senior leaders to communicate the value of this. Other senior leaders were strongly encouraged to participate in their own well-being check-in to set an example and destigmatize it. And in fact, I, as the chief wellness officer, did the very first well-being check-in so that I could then message to others that how it was and what it entailed. We found, we put together lists of eligible employees and medical staff who had had COVID patient-facing experience, and then we sent those lists to their managers or physician leader so that they were able to schedule the appointments for them. Finally, we were able to develop telephone visits in the final week of this pilot at Bridgeport. We were hoping to develop video visits for check-ins. We actually found that it was more complicated from a confidentiality perspective to use video visits because some of our so we used some volunteers who were trained mental health clinicians and they didn't have hospital access to our Zoom platform, et cetera. And so we found it was actually easier to use telephone. This ended up being very beneficial because in the long run, we have found that telephone check-ins are preferred by many because they can do them from the comfort of their own home or away from others. And there's an element of anonymity that really helps people feel more comfortable reaching out by telephone. In total at Bridgeport Hospital, we had 91 participants. 3 participated via phone consult during that final week. Of those, a full 14% were referred to our Employee Family Resources, which is our employee assistance program, for additional counseling. While that may not seem like a lot, we did only have 199 slots available for in-person visits and 19 telephone slots available in that final week. So this really does represent a significant increase in the acceptability of the program. Our third version was at Lawrence Memorial and Westerly Hospitals. Lawrence and Memorial is a 280-bed community hospital, and Westerly is a 79-bed community hospital that are both newer members of the 5-hospital system, but under the same management and leadership. Because they are further up the 95 corridor, they experienced a much smaller surge, and in fact, sent staff to other delivery networks to assist during the height. Combined, they had a peak. They peaked at 38 COVID patients and a total of 9 vented patients. And their peak was a little bit later. It was in early May as opposed to mid-April. That may have played into the initial response to the well-being check-ins, which was slightly less than at Bridgeport. This well-being check-in opportunity ran during the month of August. Communications were sent from the leadership and development specialist, who was also a member of the healthcare worker support team. Those communications were coordinated with nurse manager for additional communication. So still leadership, but not quite the same senior level of leadership. They were set up as opt-out. It was piloted first in their CCU and ICU, and they had planned to roll it out to additional units depending on how that went. 150 individuals were invited. And they had 17 participants as part of their pilot. There were no telephone check-ins done. And unfortunately, when they looked to reinstitute a little bit later, the program had been moved to our fourth hospital unit, and it was difficult to set it up again for Lawrence Memorial. Our final version is at Yale New Haven Hospital. Yale New Haven is a 1,500-bed tertiary medical center. It includes 2 campuses, Smilow Cancer Hospital, Yale New Haven Children's Hospital, and Yale New Haven Psychiatric Hospital. It is the primary teaching site for Yale School of Medicine. It peaked at about 447 COVID positive patients with 105 vented ICU patients. At Yale New Haven, the check-ins ran from September to present day. They are ongoing. They actually extended the dates twice. They initially expected it to run for 2 months, and then they found that the uptake was actually quite good, and they continued it. It is now offered as a benefit rather than a service, and there is some thought that that has impacted the uptake. It is also an opt-out program. There are multiple visual reminders throughout the hospital. So if you actually walk the corridors of the hospital, there are signs everywhere that say employee well-being check-ins here, et cetera. So it really brings it to the forefront of people's memories. There are many telephone visits. And as I mentioned, these are very well received, especially for those staff who work on weekends or nights and have and wish to still do a check-in, but don't want to come in on an off shift to do so. We've developed a threshold score by which we then refer to our EFR. And there's a crisis plan in place in case any of the individuals do have significant mental health urgent needs at the time of their evaluation. So during our first 5 months, this really represents the time between our first and second COVID wave across all 5 sites. We had 379 employees were seen. Of those, almost 40% were referred to our EFR for additional counseling. The main themes that came about were unknowns about COVID, worry about a second wave, which unfortunately we know happened, family illness, practical stressors such as childcare, homeschooling, job loss, and balancing family, work, and coping skills. As I mentioned, we've continued the program, and to date, we have seen 1,720 employees. EFR referrals remain at about 34% total. However, our EFR referrals during the current week are down to 10%. And I suspect this has to do with some of the optimism around vaccine rollout since we're now in the month of April. There were 3 urgent or critical employee referrals to mental health professionals. And our top themes on the negative side were fatigue and stress, home life, and remote learning, which is ongoing for many. Our top positive themes were actually camaraderie and team. Many felt very supported by their teammates and found that a source of connection. And many were grateful for the EFR referrals. Love the verbal feedback we've gotten, verbal and written feedback, very, very positive. So I'll just read a few, you can read some of the others. But in a time, so from staff members who participated, in a time when everyone feels helpless, I am thankful that someone cares about me. And then our screeners have found this to be a very positive experience as well. Many people just wanted to help during this pandemic, and our screeners felt that this was a very useful way to spend their time. The first one is, as a social worker, I feel like I am really helping in our fight in this pandemic. So overall, very well received. Our lessons learned to help promote this type of service are, one, to use an opt-out process. We think that that really lowers the barrier to participating. Certainly keep it voluntary, but make sure that the appointments are just generated and given to the staff and medical staff who will be participating. Use senior trusted leaders to communicate the opportunity, and encourage leaders to attend their own check-ins so they can speak from a position of knowledge of having participated in one, and also lower that stigma about participating in one. Use wording such as benefit that is particularly appealing. Provide a telephone option. Certainly ensure confidentiality. At some of our sites, people were allowed to schedule just by their first name. So it was really, truly a confidential process for them. And you can use health professionals that are already within your system, because many of them are willing to add in an extra couple of hours to do telephone screens here and there to extend the reach. All that said, our next steps at Yale New Haven, we are extending to Yellowhaven Health. We are extending to resident physicians. We have had a program for first-year resident physicians for quite a while, but this is the first time we're looking to do it on a regular annual basis for our resident physicians. And we are looking to hire additional resources to continue this program on an ongoing basis so that we can offer it to staff on probably a yearly basis going forward. With that, I will thank you and I will end.